I didn't know there was a hidden camera in our house that caught my cheating. But when Daniel turned his phone to me, showing me the footage, I knew there was no way out. The screen illuminated his face in the dim living room, his expression carved from stone. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, a desperate drumbeat against the silence between us. The footage played in an agonizing loop, me, my lover, the unmistakable betrayal unfolding in the very bed I shared with my husband. I felt sick. My stomach twisted, my skin burned, and I could barely breathe. Daniel's hand was steady as he held the phone, but I could see the tension in his fingers, the tight grip of someone barely containing his rage. "You thought I wouldn't find out," he said, his voice eerily calm. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a fact that hung between us like a noose. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What could I say? That I was sorry, that I hadn't meant to hurt him, that it hadn't been about him at all. None of it would change the reality playing in front of us. The evidence was undeniable. Daniel set the phone down on the coffee table, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "How long?" His voice was softer this time, but no less dangerous. "Daniel, how long?" My fingers curled into fists on my lap. I wanted to lie to minimize the damage, to make this somehow less catastrophic. But I owed him the truth. If I had ever loved him at all, I owed him that much. 5 months, I whispered. The words felt like broken glass in my throat.
By the way, if you're curious about what happened next, subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Thank you.
He let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. 5 months, and you still came home to me every night, slept next to me, told me you loved me. Tears welled in my eyes. "I do love you." His eyes snapped to mine, dark and unreadable. "No, Claire, if you loved me this," he gestured at the phone, the damning proof of my betrayal, "wouldn't have happened." A lump formed in my throat, thick and suffocating. He was right. Love wasn't supposed to look like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like this aching, sinking realization that I had destroyed the one person who had ever truly been mine. Silence stretched between us, vast and unbearable. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair before standing up. "I need some time." My heart clenched. "Daniel, please," he held up a hand, stopping me cold. "Don't, just don't." He turned away, heading for the door. "I can't look at you right now." And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the wreckage of everything I had broken. I woke up to the sound of the front door slamming shut. My heart leapt into my throat as I bolted upright, my breath catching in my chest. It was still dark outside, the clock on the nightstand blinking 3:47 a.m. My mind raced. Had Daniel come home, or had he left again? I forced myself out of bed, my legs trembling beneath me. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with something unspoken. I crept toward the living room, each step hesitant, my hands gripping the edges of my nightshirt. The lights were still off, but as I turned the corner, I saw him. Daniel stood in the middle of the room, his silhouette barely visible against the faint glow of the streetlights outside. His shoulders were slumped, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. He hadn't even bothered to take off his shoes. "Where were you?" My voice came out weaker than I intended. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he let out a slow, measured breath before turning to face me. Drove around, walked for a bit. His tone was flat, detached. "Thought about things." I swallowed hard. "And," he ran a hand through his hair, his fingers lingering at the back of his neck. "And I don't know what the hell to do with this, Claire. I don't know how to be in the same house as you right now." I flinched, my stomach twisting. "I don't," he interrupted, shaking his head. "Not tonight, I just need to not hear your voice for a while." His words stung more than I thought possible, but I nodded anyway. What else could I do? I had already taken everything from him. I had no right to ask for anything more. "I'll sleep in the guest room," I murmured, stepping back. He didn't respond, didn't acknowledge me as I turned and made my way down the hall. As I closed the door behind me, I finally let the tears fall, silent and endless. The silence in the house felt different now. It wasn't the comfortable quiet we used to share, the kind where words weren't needed because we understood each other. This silence was suffocating, pressing down on me with the weight of everything that had been exposed. I sat on the couch, my legs curled under me, staring at the darkened television screen. My reflection was there, pale and hollow-eyed, a woman I barely recognized. Daniel had left hours ago. I didn't know where he went. Part of me wanted to call him to know if he was safe, but I had lost the right to worry about him. I had no idea if he'd even come back tonight or ever. When the front door finally opened, I jumped. He stepped inside, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't look at me. He just closed the door, locked it behind him, and ran a hand through his hair. I could smell the cold night air on him, mixed with something else, maybe the faint scent of whiskey. "You're still here," he said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation, like he had expected me to be gone by now. "Where else would I go?" My voice came out softer than I intended. I was afraid that if I spoke too loudly, the fragile moment between us would shatter completely. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I don't know, Claire, maybe to him." I flinched. "I deserved that. No, it was never about leaving you." His jaw clenched, and for the first time, his eyes met mine. They were tired, filled with something that looked almost like disgust, but I wasn't sure if it was directed at me or at himself for still being here. "You don't get to say that," he muttered, shaking his head. "You don't get to act like you cared about this marriage while you were screwing someone else in our bed." I swallowed, my throat dry. I know I don't deserve. Stop." His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "I don't want to hear it, not tonight." I pressed my lips together, nodding. What else could I do? Apologies wouldn't fix this. Nothing would. I had broken something between us that couldn't be undone. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his face with both hands. "I don't even know what I'm supposed to do now. Do I kick you out? Do we pretend none of this happened? Do I go upstairs and try to sleep next to the woman who just admitted she's been lying to me for months?" Each question hit harder than the last, and I felt my chest tight. "I'll sleep in the guest room," I said quickly. "I won't push you for anything, I don't want to make this worse." "It's already worse, Claire." He let out a bitter chuckle. "There's no fixing this." I wanted to ask if that meant he had already made up his mind, if he was done with me completely. But I didn't, because deep down I knew that no matter what he decided, I had already lost him. The next morning, the house felt colder than usual. Not physically, I knew the thermostat was still set to its usual temperature, but the air carried a weight that hadn't been there before, a hollowness. The kind that settles in when something once whole has cracked wide open. I sat on the edge of the guest bed, staring at the floor, trying to summon the courage to step outside and face whatever came next. I finally forced myself up, padding barefoot into the kitchen. The scent of coffee lingered in the air, but the pot was empty, a single used mug sitting in the sink. Daniel was already awake. He was here, that was something, a small mercy. I found him at the dining table, dressed for work, scrolling through his phone like it was any other morning, except it was. His shoulders were tense, his expression unreadable. He didn't look up when I entered. "Morning," I said, my voice hesitant. He didn't answer right away. Just when I thought he might ignore me completely, he exhaled sharply and muttered, "Morning." It wasn't much, but it was more than I deserved. I moved toward the counter, pouring myself a cup of coffee. My hands trembled as I lifted it to my lips. Daniel finally set his phone down, rubbing a hand over his face. "I won't make a decision overnight," he said, voice tight. "I need time." I nodded slowly. "I understand." Another heavy silence stretched between us before he spoke again. "Do you even know why?" The question hit harder than I expected. I set my cup down, my stomach twisting. I don't think there's a simple answer." He let out a bitter laugh. "Try me." I swallowed hard. "It wasn't about you, Daniel. It was never about you." His jaw clenched. "That's not an answer, Claire." I closed my eyes, searching for the right words. "I don't know how to explain it. I wasn't unhappy with you. But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like me. I felt invisible, like I was just moving through life on autopilot." Daniel's eyes darkened. "So what, sleeping with someone else made you feel seen?" The shame burned deep. I think I was chasing something I couldn't even name." He shook his head, scoffing. "That's a hell of a way to figure yourself out, Claire." "I know," I whispered, my throat tight, "and I wish I could take it back." He stared at me for a long moment before standing up. "Well, you can't." He grabbed his keys from the table. "I need to go to work." I nodded, but as he walked past me, something in me snapped. "Daniel?" He stopped but didn't turn around. "I love you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, I thought he might say something back. But then he walked out the door, leaving me alone once again. Daniel didn't come home that night. I waited, listening for the sound of his car pulling into the driveway, for the familiar jingle of his keys in the door, but the house remained silent. I tried calling once. It rang, then went to voicemail. I didn't try again. Instead, I sat on the couch with the TV on low, not really watching, just needing the noise to drown out my thoughts. When I finally went to bed, the sheets in the guest room felt foreign, stiff, and cold, like I was sleeping in a stranger's house. Morning came too quickly, and when I stepped into the kitchen, I found it exactly as I had left it. No sign that Daniel had been here at all. My stomach twisted as I brewed coffee, the scent filling the empty space around me. I had no right to expect anything else, but the ache in my chest didn't care about logic. I wanted him to be here, even if he couldn't stand the sight of me. I spent the day in limbo, alternating between cleaning things that didn't need cleaning and scrolling through my phone mindlessly, as if any distraction could make the weight in my chest disappear. I ignored the texts from friends, the messages from my sister, all asking how I was doing. They didn't know, no one knew yet, and I wasn't ready to explain. It was past 8 when I finally heard his car. My pulse jumped as I stood from the couch, uncertain whether to stay or hide. The door opened and Daniel stepped inside, his expression unreadable, his movements slow. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept. His clothes were wrinkled, his jaw covered in the shadow of a day's worth of stubble. He didn't acknowledge me at first, just toed off his shoes and tossed his keys onto the counter. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. He exhaled heavily, rubbing the back of his neck. "At a hotel." His tone was flat, like he didn't want to elaborate. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." He finally looked at me, his gaze sharp and tired all at once. Neither was I, his words stung, but I nodded. Did you sleep? He let out a short, humorless laugh. Not really. Silence stretched between us, thick with everything that hadn't been said. I shifted on my feet, the nerves creeping under my skin. Daniel, Claire, don't. His voice was calm but firm. Not right now. I pressed my lips together, nodding. I wanted to say something that would fix this, but there was nothing left to say. He didn't want my apologies. He didn't want my excuses. He just wanted space. And for the first time, I truly understood that space might be the only thing keeping him from leaving for good. He moved past me, heading toward the stairs. I stayed in the kitchen, listening as his footsteps faded down the hall. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of our bedroom door closing. He wasn't sleeping in the guest room. He wasn't sleeping on the couch. He was in our bed, alone. I stayed there for a long time, staring at the darkened doorway, wondering if this was how our marriage would end, not with screaming or accusations, but with silence thick enough to drown us both. The days that followed blurred together in a fog of half-spoken words and spaces that felt too big between us. Daniel and I existed in the same house, but barely. He went to work early, came home late, and when he was here, he was somewhere else entirely. I stopped trying to talk to him because I knew he wasn't ready to hear me. Maybe he never would be. Maybe this was just the slow unraveling of everything we had built. I wanted to give him time, but every minute felt like a countdown to the inevitable. He didn't look at me the same way anymore. When his eyes met mine, they weren't warm, weren't familiar. They were cold, distant, like I was nothing more than a stranger standing in his home. That was the worst part, not the anger, not even the resentment. It was the absence of anything at all. On the fourth night, I found myself standing outside our bedroom door. He had stopped locking it, but he still slept alone. I pressed my palm against the wood, feeling its cool surface beneath my fingertips, trying to find the courage to knock. But what was I expecting? That he would let me in? That he would suddenly forget? I turned away, retreating to the guest room, my body heavy with exhaustion. Sleep had become impossible, my mind restless with every worst-case scenario. What if he never forgave me? What if he decided he couldn't do this anymore? What if this was already over and we were just going through the motions until one of us finally said it out loud? The next morning, Daniel was already dressed when I stepped into the kitchen. He was at the counter, pouring coffee, moving like he always did, but there was a stiffness to him that hadn't been there before. He didn't look at me when he spoke. I think we should talk. My stomach clenched. Okay. He gestured toward the table and I sat, my hands curling around the edge of my sweater as he lowered himself into the chair across from me. He took a slow breath, his fingers wrapped around his coffee mug. I don't know how to do this, Claire. His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something raw. I don't know how to look at you and not see it. I swallowed hard. I know. He finally met my eyes. Do you? His question held weight, a challenge I wasn't sure I could answer. I know I hurt you, and I know that no matter what I say, it won't change what I did. He nodded slowly, looking down at his coffee. I've been trying to figure out if I can live with it. His voice was quiet, almost like he was speaking more to himself than to me. The words settled between us, heavier than I expected. He wasn't saying he wanted to leave, but he wasn't saying he wanted to stay either. He was stuck in the in-between, and I had no way of pulling him out. I inhaled shakily. Do you think you can? Daniel didn't answer right away. He just stared at his coffee like it held an answer he hadn't found yet. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled. I don't know. And somehow that uncertainty hurt more than if he had just told me it was over. Daniel's uncertainty lingered in the air long after he left for work. It clung to me, settled deep in my chest like an ache I couldn't soothe. I spent the morning packing, drinking too much coffee, running my fingers along the edge of the kitchen counter as if grounding myself to something tangible would stop my thoughts from spiraling. It didn't. Nothing did. By the afternoon, I forced myself to leave the house. I hadn't been anywhere but work and the grocery store in days, trapped in the suffocating quiet of our home. I drove without a destination, the radio playing softly, though I wasn't really listening. My mind kept circling back to the way Daniel had looked at me over the kitchen table, tired, distant, like he was already half gone. I ended up at a cafe we used to go to on weekends. The familiarity of it was almost painful. The same wooden tables, the same chalkboard menu above the counter, the same scent of roasted coffee beans and cinnamon. We had spent so many mornings here, sitting in our usual booth by the window, talking about everything and nothing. I almost turned around and left, but my feet carried me inside before I could think twice. I ordered a drink, found a seat in the corner, and stared out the window. The world outside moved on as if nothing had changed. People laughed, walked hand in hand, sipped coffee without a second thought. And yet, for me, everything had changed. The weight of my choices sat heavy in my chest, a constant reminder that I had shattered something I might never be able to piece back together. I didn't realize how long I had been sitting there until my phone buzzed on the table. My heart jumped as I saw Daniel's name on the screen. A simple text. Where are you? I hesitated before typing back. At the cafe. The dots appeared, then stopped, then appeared again. Finally, his response came. "Can you come home?" A lump formed in my throat as I stared at the words. He wasn't asking where I was to check up on me. He wanted me to come home, and I had no idea what that meant. I typed it quick on my way and grabbed my bag, my hands trembling slightly as I pushed out of my chair. The drive back felt longer than usual, my pulse pounding with every mile. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there. He was waiting. I stepped inside to find him standing near the window, hands in his pockets, his jaw tight. He turned when he heard the door close, his eyes scanning my face like he was searching for something he wasn't sure he'd find. "You left," he said quietly, his tone unreadable. I swallowed. "I needed air." He nodded slowly. "So did I." Silence settled between us, thick and unspoken. Then he exhaled sharply, rubbing his face with both hands before looking at me again. "Claire, I need to know something. Do you actually want to fix this, or are we just delaying the inevitable?" My breath caught. The way he said it, like he was giving me a choice, like he needed to hear it from me before he could decide anything at all. "I want to fix it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "More than anything." He studied me for a long moment before nodding, almost to himself. "Then we need to figure out how, because right now I don't know where to start." "We need to figure out how." The words replayed in my mind long after Daniel said them, their weight pressing down on me as I sat across from him at the kitchen table. There was no anger in his voice, no sharp edges, but there was something worse: uncertainty. He didn't know if we could fix this. He didn't know if I was worth the effort, and I had no idea how to prove that I was. "I don't know where to start either," I admitted, my fingers gripping the edge of my sweater. "But I know I don't want to lose you." Daniel exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "That's not enough, Claire. Wanting isn't enough. If it were, we wouldn't be here." He was right, it wasn't enough. Love, as much as I wanted to believe in its power, wasn't enough to erase what I had done. I had to show him. I had to make him believe that this wasn't just guilt speaking, that I wasn't just afraid of losing the life we had built. "What do you need from me?" I asked, my voice small. "What would help?" He ran a hand over his face, his exhaustion evident. "I don't know. I don't even know if anything can, but I know I can't just pretend this didn't happen. I can't wake up next to you and pretend that every time I close my eyes I don't see it." I swallowed hard, nodding. "I understand. Do you?" His eyes met mine, sharp, searching. "Because I don't think you do. You made a choice, Claire, over and over again for 5 months. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision. And now I have to decide if I can live with that." The truth of it hit me like a fist to the stomach. I wanted to argue, to tell him I wasn't thinking, that I wasn't myself, but that would be a lie. I had been thinking, I had been myself, and still I had done it. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," I whispered. "And I don't expect it, but I do know that I love you, and I don't want this to be the end of us." Daniel let out a slow breath, staring at the tabletop like it held the answers we couldn't find. "I don't want it to be the end either, but I don't know how to move forward." Silence stretched between us, a deep, aching void. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again, his voice quieter. "We need space, not from each other, but from everything else." I frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked up at me, his gaze steady. "We get out of here, just us. No distractions, no routine, no pretending. We go somewhere neutral, somewhere that isn't this house, and we figure out if there's anything left to save." The idea was so unexpected that I hesitated. "You think that will help?" "I don't know, but I know I can't keep doing this, walking around like a ghost in my own life, trying to avoid you in my own home." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Okay, then let's go." A flicker of something resolve maybe passed through his eyes. "We leave tomorrow." The next morning, I packed a small bag, unsure of what to bring. It felt strange, leaving our house together like this, not running away, not separating, but stepping into the unknown. Daniel hadn't said much after making the decision. He barely looked at me as we moved through the motions of getting ready. I didn't ask where we were going. It didn't matter. I would have followed him anywhere if it meant we had a chance. The drive was quiet. The silence between us wasn't tense, but it wasn't comfortable either. It was heavy, filled with words neither of us knew how to say. I kept my hands folded in my lap, watching the landscape shift from city streets to open highway. We were leaving everything behind for a little while, but I knew that no matter how far we went, the weight of what I'd done would come with us. After nearly 3 hours, Daniel pulled into a small roadside motel, the kind with a faded neon sign and doors that opened straight into the parking lot. It wasn't a vacation spot. It wasn't romantic. It was neutral, a place that held no memories, no reminders of what we used to be. Maybe that was the point. Daniel grabbed his bag and stepped out of the car without a word. I followed, my stomach twisting as I watched him check us in. When he handed me the key to our room, our fingers brushed, but he pulled away quickly, like even that small touch was too much. I tried not to let it sting. The room was simple: a bed, a small table, a TV mounted on the wall, a single window with heavy curtains that barely let the light in. It felt unfamiliar, impersonal, but maybe that was what we needed. Daniel set his bag down near the door and turned to face me for the first time since we arrived. "I don't know how this is supposed to work," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I don't know what I'm expecting from this. I took a hesitant step forward. Neither do I, but I'm here and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. He studied me for a long moment before nodding. Then let's start with honesty, real honesty, no more carefully worded answers, no more avoiding the truth. I swallowed hard. Okay. He sat down on the edge of the bed, his shoulders tense. Why him? The question cut through me, sharp and precise. I had known it was coming, but that didn't make it any easier to answer. Because he was you. The words slipped out before I could filter them, but I didn't take them back. I meant them. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. Explain. I sat across from him, forcing myself to meet his gaze. Because I felt like I was fatting, like I wasn't seen, wasn't needed. And that's not your fault, Daniel. I never said anything. I never told you how I felt because I thought it wasn't fair to put that on you. But then he came along and he noticed me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt different, not better, just different. And I chased that feeling even though I knew it would destroy us. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. So I was supposed to read your mind, just magically know you felt that way? No, I said quickly. That's not what I'm saying. I should have talked to you. I should have been honest before it ever got to that point, but I didn't, and that's on me. He was quiet for a long time, his fingers tapping against his knee in thought. You still talk to him? No. Would you if I wasn't here? The question hurt, but I understood why he asked. No. He nodded slowly, as if trying to decide whether to believe me. Okay. I wasn't sure what that meant, but for now it was enough. That night, Daniel barely spoke. After our conversation, he had nodded, stood up, and stepped into the bathroom, closing the door behind him. I sat there, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of what progress, if any, we had made. I had told him the truth, given him the rawest parts of my failure, and he hadn't walked out. That had to mean something. But the way he looked at me, like he was still trying to decide whether he could ever touch me again, made it clear that nothing was fixed. When he finally emerged, his face was blank, unreadable. He climbed into bed fully clothed, turning onto his side, facing away from me. He didn't say goodnight. I didn't expect him to. I lay on the other side of the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to his breathing, wondering if he was asleep or just pretending. My mind spun in circles, replaying the past, searching for a moment where I could have stopped all of this from happening. But there wasn't just one moment. There were hundreds. Thousands. Every time I had ignored the gnawing feeling in my gut, every time I had chosen silence over honesty, every time I had made the conscious decision to meet someone else instead of going home to my husband. I don't know when I finally drifted off, but when I woke up, the bed was empty. My heart clenched as I sat up, scanning the room, but Daniel's bag was still by the door, his keys still on the table. He hadn't left. Not yet. I forced myself up, slipping out of bed, and found him outside, standing by the car, a cigarette between his fingers. He didn't smoke often, only when he was stressed, when he needed something to do with his hands. You're up early, I said cautiously. He exhaled, the smoke curling into the crisp morning air. Didn't sleep much. I hesitated, hugging my arms around myself. Me neither. Silence settled between us, stretching longer than I was comfortable with. Finally, he flicked the cigarette away, his jaw tightening as he turned to face me fully. I keep thinking about what you said last night, about why. I swallowed. And he ran a hand through his hair, his exhaustion evident. I don't know if I can accept it, I understand it, but I don't know if I can live with it. I forced myself to hold his gaze. I can't change the past, Daniel, but I can promise you that I won't ever do this to you again. His expression remained guarded. And I'm just supposed to believe that? No, I admitted. I don't expect you to believe anything I say right now, but if you give me the chance, I'll show you. He studied me for a long moment, then sighed, shaking his head. I don't know, Claire, I really don't. The words weren't a rejection. They weren't an answer at all, just another question hanging in the air between us, waiting to be resolved. And for now, that had to be enough. The drive back home was quieter than the one that brought us here. The weight of our conversations, of everything said and unsaid, sat between us. Daniel's hands gripped the wheel, his expression unreadable as he kept his eyes on the road. I wanted to say something, anything to bridge the silence, but I didn't know how. I had spent so long making the wrong choices that I wasn't sure what the right one even looked like anymore. As we pulled into the driveway, I felt a sharp pang in my chest. Our home, the place that had once been a refuge, now felt foreign. Daniel cut the engine but didn't move right away. He sat there, staring straight ahead, his fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. Finally, he sighed, pushing the door open and stepping out. I followed, my heart pounding. Inside, everything was just as we had left it, neat, untouched, but heavy with the weight of what had happened within these walls. Daniel dropped his bag by the door and ran a hand through his hair. I don't know what happens next, he admitted, his voice low. I don't know if we can be what we were. I swallowed hard. I don't either, but I don't want to give up on us. He let out a breath, nodding slightly. Then we take it one day at a time, no promises, no pretending everything is fine, just seeing if we can find something worth holding on to. It wasn't the resolution I had been hoping for. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a guarantee that he would stay. But it was something, a thread of hope, fragile and uncertain. I reached for his hand hesitantly, and for the first time in weeks, he didn't pull away. His fingers curled around mine, not tightly, not in the way they used to, but enough to keep trying.
Thank you for watching the video. If you want to hear more stories, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Videos are released every day. Good luck to everyone.